Dirty Politics, Hard Times. Book 2. The Millowner's Daughter. Chapter 4. Irene Rose turned on her side, slowly opening her eyes, her hand searching for Michael. The space beside her felt warm, but it was empty. She stretched and thought about the events of the previous evening. They'd had guests to dinner, a dozen men in total, half of them accompanied by wives or sweethearts. Every one of the men, and most of the women, were Chartists or trade unionists, the majority both. It was the first weekend in June 1842. The last few months of 1841 had witnessed sporadic outbreaks of wage-cutting and workers' resistance, the latter being uneven and not always successful. The mill hands at Droylsden's New Mill and Lomas Mill had returned to work victorious, having dealt their owners an unexpected bloody nose. Others weren't so well organised. Those at Medlock Mill had succumbed to their master's wishes without resistance. This in turn had encouraged half a dozen more Droylsden mill owners to cut wages, and again, with the exception of Lum Mill on the edge of Littlemoss, the masters achieved success. Nonetheless, workers were learning lessons, and trade union membership in the town was growing apace, even in the mills where workers had failed to put up any resistance. Apart from a brief confrontation involving the Clayton colliers, the activity seemed to be confined to Droylsden, but during the spring of 1842, further outbreaks occurred as far afield as Ashton-under-Lyne, Blackburn, Bolton and Chorley. Michael O'Donnell became convinced the manufacturers were probing and testing the state of union organisation and the workers' ability and willingness to fight back. In preparation, he assumed for a larger and more coordinated confrontation, probably along the lines Matthew had predicted the previous year. With the downturn in trade developing fast, the Anti-Corn Law League stepped up its own campaigns. The leadership of the slowly developing trade union movement throughout Salford, Manchester and the surrounding towns of South East Lancashire and North East Cheshire was replete with Chartists. As a result, at every mass meeting of workers, they continually stressed the need to fight for the 6 points of the Charter, alongside the immediate fight against wage cuts, and stressed the importance of the continuing campaign for the 10-hour bill. Chartism's roots lay in the need to link the disparate struggles for trade union rights and against the Combination Acts, and their successor, the Master and Servant Act, for the repeal of the Poor Law, the extension and enforcement of the Factory Acts, the agitation for the 10-hour day, and the ending of child labour, neglect and abuse, all of which fed into it. At first, this struggle for universal male suffrage, vote by ballot, the ending of property qualifications to stand for elections, equal constituencies, paid MPs to enable the poorest to stand for election, and annually elected parliaments to make MPs more accountable to their electorate and to minimise corruption, was carried out by a collection of loosely knit, locally based organisations. These mainly comprised sections of the lower middle class alongside its main base of working class members, both classes having been denied the franchise by the 1832 Electoral Reform Act. Following the euphoria of the great demonstration on Kersal Moor in 1838, Chartism seemed to lose its initial momentum. A follow-up demonstration at the same venue in March 1839 attracted far less support, although 30,000 people did turn out. In the June, the first monster petition for the implementation of the Charter had been presented to Parliament and dismissed out of hand by an overwhelming majority of MPs without any debate. This off-handed treatment of a petition signed by over 1.5 million people, the result of many thousands of hours of patient argument and hard endeavour, created widespread anger amongst working people, and there were many who felt violent methods were needed to secure their rights. The total British electorate at the time, including Ireland, was only 800,000 out of a population of some 22 millions. A meeting in Rochdale, held on the 25th of June that year, for the purpose of strengthening the organisation of the Chartist movement and intent on calling for a national holiday in August, a euphemism for a general strike, had been infiltrated by government spies. Key members of the Chartist leadership, including Fergus O'Connor, were arrested in the July and August and imprisoned in Britain if lucky, transported to Australia if not. Divisions plagued the leadership, and for many the abortive Newport uprising in November 1839 was the final straw. By 1840 it was clear if Chartism had a future, it had to be placed on a firm national organisational base. It required democratic local structures and an elected national executive, rather than rely on its many gifted orators and flamboyant personalities, such as Fergus O'Connor, to draw crowds to monster meetings. James Leach played a key role. Chartist meetings took place throughout Britain in the spring and summer of 1840. A National Chartist Delegate Conference held in Manchester on the 20th of July at the Griffin Tavern on Great Ancoat Street, with Leach in the chair, considered a number of competing options, finally forming the National Charter Association, thus inaugurating what was to become the world's first working-class political party. Subsequently elected President of the National Charter Association by branch ballot, with every member, male and female, having the right to vote, James could rightly claim to be the first man elected by a national ballot to lead a working-class organisation. Indeed, he was the first man in British history to be elected to any political organisation by national ballot. The National Charter Association quickly grew in stature and numbers. In February 1841, Chartists were organised in 80 branches. By December, there were 300 branches, and over 350 by April 1842. The organisation continued to enjoy vigorous growth, particularly in the north of England, the Midlands, and the industrial belts of Scotland and South Wales, with widespread support amongst members of the newer craft trade unions and within their leaderships. May 1842 witnessed the second Chartist petition presented to Parliament. It contained over 3.5 million signatures, a quite amazing number, exceeding the electorate returning the MPs to office by 4 to 1. Once more the Commons rejected it out of hand, and once more they inflamed the temper of the majority disenfranchised working classes. An editorial in the Northern Star, which Irene Rose had framed to show any who attempted to undermine the case of working people and their rightful cause, stated, 3.5 million have quietly, orderly, soberly, peaceably, but firmly asked of their rulers to do justice, and their rulers have turned a deaf ear to that protest. 3.5 million of people have asked permission to detail their wrongs and enforce their claims for right, and the House has resolved they should not be heard. 3.5 million of the slave class have holden out the olive branch of peace to the enfranchised and privileged classes, and sought for a firm and compact union on the principle of equality before the law, and the enfranchised and privileged have refused to enter into a treaty. The same class is to be a slave class still. The mark and brand of inferiority is not to be removed. The assumption of inferiority is still to be maintained. The people are not to be free. The old idea of a holy month or a month of Sundays, as Bess Ackroyd used to describe it, a general strike for the implementation of the People's Charter, was once again being discussed. Chartists were not alone in stepping up their activity. With a Tory government in power, the publications of the Anti-Corn Law League and the speakers at its public meetings were adopting a more radical, strident, and at times pseudo-revolutionary tone, calling on workers to rebel against rising food prices. In February, on the 14th, a meeting of Liberals, including supporters of the Anti-Corn Law League and low middle-class Chartists, drew up a petition urging the repeal of the Corn Laws and the adoption of the Charter. Throughout the spring, distress increased and agitation grew as the downturn in trade developed. Sections of the middle classes, determined to force the repeal of the Corn Laws and defeat the Tory government, showed a propensity to forgo their law-abiding habits, although they were trying to whip up the working classes to do their work for them, whilst they stood back as onlookers. If caught with their pants down, they would insist, "It weren't me, Gov." It was against this rapidly developing background that the dinner party for Irene Rose's and Michael O'Donnell's guests had taken place. The growing industrial unrest, the increased agitation by the Anti-Corn Law League, and the need to step up the campaign for the Charter and the 10-hour bill, holding centre stage in the lively discussions taking place during the meal and afterwards. The trade recession, now some 2 years old, had deepened, and the downturn predicted by Matthew Etherow has started to bite hard, its chilly breeze even blowing up the hitherto seemingly invincible iron corsets of Manchester's fast-growing engineering industry, stoking working-class hunger further. His theory on the cotton manufacturers' intentions to link the Anti-Corn Law League campaign with further wage cuts, turnouts and working-class agitation gained credibility, and even trade union activists who tended to view it as being rather far-fetched recognised the sense in making preparations. Since the beginning of 1840, most workers had suffered 3 separate wage cuts and were taking home 70% of the old wage rate. Top-paid weavers were down to 8 shillings a week, and rents averaged 3 shillings a week. Another cut would devastate all. Imaginations ran riot amongst Irene Rose's guests, new tactics devised and thought about, theories of how workers might influence and direct events, and take some control of their workplaces in the case of turnouts or lockouts, submitted to the test of argument and peer review. Gradually, a general policy began to emerge, the responsibility for the implementation of which would initially rest on the shoulders of one man, who all present agreed to support. Alexander Hutchinson, an engineer and delegate of the Manchester Wire Drawers and Card Makers, had been instrumental in persuading the National Charter Association to hold its annual conference marking the anniversary of the Peterloo Massacre in Manchester on the 17th and 18th of August, when a statue of Orator Hunt was to be publicly unveiled. The Chartists and trade unionists around Irene Rose's table agreed that if the present industrial unrest continued, a conference of trade delegates should take place to provide leadership and coordination of the workers' struggle against wage cuts immediately before the Chartist convention, their intention being to influence the latter and persuade it to provide national political leadership to the workers' economic struggle. They agreed to support the election of Hutchinson as chairman of the Trades Conference, and that of Charles Stewart, a delegate of the mechanics from Patricroft, as secretary. They agreed to campaign to win the conference to link the demands of the workers with support for the Charter, whilst voicing opposition to the Anti-Corn Law League. The latter aim was important, indeed crucial, if the false claims of the Anti-Corn Law League to represent working people were to be undermined. Irene Rose had thoroughly enjoyed the evening and taken full advantage of the proceedings to not only voice her own opinions but to draw on others' knowledge and thus augment her own. It was of course unusual for women to enjoy discussing such lofty subjects, hitherto regarded as the monopoly domain of men. She noticed how many of the women present tended to keep to themselves, away from their menfolk, although most participated in vigorous debates of their own. Nonetheless, Irene Rose soon discovered the tale of her intervention at Lomas Mill had achieved almost legendary status, and the men tended to accept her as one of them, even though some still tended to be patronising. In such cases, Irene Rose had her own subtle means of retaliating, which tended to add levity to the evening, at least for those men and women more sympathetic to the feminist cause. John Doherty and James Leach had taken the trouble to introduce her to Alexander Hutchinson. Later on she found young Albert Ashton entertaining, as well as informative about the role of the women operatives in organising the new union structures at Lomas Mill. She'd informed him of the cooperative enterprise in Ancoats, and he'd agreed to bring a delegation of spinners to view it and learn how it was organised, being intent on emulating the Gibraltar Mill workers' endeavours. At this point, Rose's husband, emerging into the bedroom with a tray on which china rattled, a milk jug wobbled, and a teapot balanced, rudely interrupted Irene Rose's recollections of the dinner party. "Breakfast in bed, Rose," he announced, placing the tray on the small table next the bed as he walked over to draw the curtains and allow the morning sunshine to flood the room. "Leave the curtains for now, Michael," she responded, struggling upright. She patted the eiderdown. "Come here, my love, drink your tea and come back to bed." Whilst his daughter, for once in her life, enjoyed the luxury of staying abed, Matthew Etherow was already up and doing. He'd arranged to meet Councillor Davitt and Daniel Ackroyd at Mary's Kitchen, with a view to showing Davitt how his scheme to improve his workers' housing was proceeding, and to draw attention to problems he thought it was the responsibility of the corporation to address. He'd left his home at Ardwick Green in an ebullient mood. His spirits soared, having been more than a little impressed by the discussion the previous evening. His confidence progressive social change could be achieved growing. Unlike most of the manufacturers, Matthew had always viewed working people with respect, not least because he and his fellow mill owner and brother George had started work as apprentices at the age of 8 in their father's first mill. As a result, they not only gained a good grounding in every aspect of mill work, but also knew intimately the conditions and privations their fellow apprentices and their parents suffered in their domestic lives. The quality of the discussion and debates at the dinner party, the constructive atmosphere in which they'd taken place, and the good-humoured and indeed often jocular way points were made, had only served to reinforce and broaden his respect. As he walked down London Road and crossed the Medlock, enjoying the sunshine, he compared his daughter's get-together with similar events organised by his fellow mill owners and other industrialists. All too often, any discussions and debates in the latter soirees tended either to be an extension of the marketplace, where deals were done and favours sought, or descended into a form of vulgar boasting, an ostentatious display of wealth and possessions, included in which were the manufacturer's mobile jewels and chattels, their decorative wives and daughters. The latter often found themselves bartered for marriage, to cement business deals and build manufacturing and financial dynasties, whilst their husbands' business rivals often seduced the former, as if such liaisons were part and parcel of the natural competition between individual capitalists. Of course, when such adulteries and fornications took place, they had to remain hidden and secret, so as not to offend the prevailing Victorian version of morality. However, the same morality allowed children and adults to die in poverty and starvation, and as long as such poverty remained hidden from the gaze of the privileged few, they could deny its existence. Victorian morality was essentially Janus-like, a bit like Manchester's buildings, the finest line in the main thoroughfares open to the public gaze, with the dankest, dirtiest and darkest houses of the labouring masses carefully hidden away, where they could be ignored. There were those who regarded the reality of Victorian middle-class marriage as little more than a thinly veiled form of prostitution. Matthew tended to sympathise with them, knowing all too well how many had married for money or prestige rather than love, how the wives of his fellow manufacturers were often exploited and degraded by their husbands, and how many of the women cheated in their turn. In the brave new anarchic world of laissez-faire capitalism, all relationships tended to be reduced to cash relationships, and the middle-class form of marriage was no exception to the rule. Apart from Irene Rose and himself, all the guests at the Ardwick house had been people who suffered at one time or another the worst privations and excesses of the manufacturing system, and had somehow managed to fight back. They'd pulled themselves, along with others, out of the morass into which they'd been submerged, educated themselves and each other, and throughout remained loyal to their class. Their clothes may have been of rough fustian cloth, rather than worsted wool or fine linen, their hands cut and calloused, their accents rough and ready, but they could speak out in a language common people understood. They could put across well-thought-out arguments and complex ideas. Most had no formal education, yet they taught each other to read and write. Many, like the handloom weaver Samuel Bamford, composed poetry and songs, whilst others authored inspiring treatises and stimulating books. Many were accomplished musicians, and others painters and artists. They were familiar with the works of Bacon and the latter materialists, Hobbes, Locke and Collins, Dodwell, Coward, Hartley and Priestley, who, having demolished theism and theology, had placed materialist philosophy on a sound foundation. Michael O'Donnell's friend and compatriot John Doherty, James Leach, Abel Heywood and other working-class publishers made the works of St. Simon, Fourier, Rousseau, and other philosophers available in English translations, as well as publications by Carlyle, Thomas Paine, Robert Owen and many more, often issuing them in serialized form to make them affordable. John Doherty, who had attended the dinner party with his wife Laura, had particularly impressed Matthew. They talked about the campaign against child labour and for the protection of children generally. John had presented the Millowner with a copy of a memoir of Robert Blincoe, a narrative written by John Brown of the life of a pauper child which he, Doherty, had published. St Pancras Workhouse in London had sold Robert Blincoe as an indentured and unpaid apprentice to the owners of Loudon Mill in Nottingham, who subsequently sold him on to the owners of Lytton Mill in Derbyshire's Peak District, a particularly cruel and barbaric set of employers. Robert subsequently moved to Manchester, where he met and campaigned with Doherty against the scourge of child labour. Some think Dickens read the story of his life, and it forms the basis for his novel Oliver Twist. Above all other qualities that impressed Matthew, these representatives of the working poor instinctively knew the importance of solidarity. In some cases it was felt subconsciously, whilst in others it was very much a conscious thing, but each in their own way espoused the principle that the basic condition for the advancement of each individual worker was the advancement of all. They were essentially class-conscious people who were coming to understand their personal liberation could only be achieved together in cooperation and unity through the liberation of the working class as a whole, and in achieving this, they could liberate all classes. The middle classes and the landed gentry wrote working people off almost as if they comprised a subhuman species incapable of making sensible decisions, let alone run complex enterprises or engage in politics and government. They justified the long hours and low wages they subjected their workers to by arguing it was essentially for their benefit. Shorter hours would lead to drunkenness and idleness, higher wages to a diet too rich for their constitutions. In the same way, employing children at back-breaking tasks kept them off the streets and out of mischief. It taught them civility and respect for their masters. Thus again, it was for the child's benefit. The idea they needed a childhood and should be allowed to play, explore and learn about the world in which they lived, taken for granted not so long ago, had become a completely alien and revolutionary concept. Matthew thought otherwise. He carefully weighed up his own interests and his standing within manufacturing society, placed them on the scales and tested them against his humanist goals, his social and scientific knowledge, his personal morality, and his strong belief that all human beings were created equal and were dependent on each other. He decided to stick with and develop his own moral code and to support the advancement of the workers' struggles for a better life with any and all the means at his disposal. Matthew remained convinced the next few weeks and months would test the integrity and purpose of the men and women Irene, Rose and Michael had assembled the night before. Every instinct told him great events were soon to take place and tremendous social forces unleashed, which could well determine the political and social character of Britain for decades to come. He'd soon be proved right, although his sense of timing was a little out. The time was already upon them. The initial skirmishes had taken place, and the real major clashes were only days away. They wouldn't commence in Manchester or the surrounding textile towns, but further south, and for once the cotton manufacturers were not directly involved, although other manufacturers were, and they soon would be. The struggle about Twenshoe would also have significant and lasting repercussions outside Britain, not least in its penal colony, Australia. Chapter 5. Irene Rose decided she needed a holiday from politics and the worry of industrial unrest. She required a short break, a bit of fresh air and sun to revitalise herself, to prepare for the struggles she knew were about to ensue, and she was sure young Daniel did too. The fact it was his 5th birthday was an added incentive. She decided it was time to visit an old friend of her mother, who, her father had been informed, had fallen on hard times and suffered poor health. It was a beautiful summer's day and presented a golden opportunity to take young Daniel on an expedition into the foothills of the Pennines. They'd stay the night with Alice, or, if she wasn't in a position to provide hospitality, resort to a nearby hostelry. Being trapped in the middle of a slum district of Manchester all the time couldn't be good for the lad, as far as the mill-owner's daughter was concerned. Whilst her father was a Mancunian, born and bred, her mother hailed from Broadbottom, a tiny hamlet nestling at the head of the Longdendale Valley, between the mill towns of Stalybridge, Hyde, Hadfield and Glossop. Her mother had often taken her on trips to the countryside when she was a youngster, and she had many fond memories of their expeditions. It was August the 6th, a Saturday. Irene Rose set out in the pony and trap at a leisurely pace from the house in Ardwick, one arm around young Daniel, who gazed around him in wonder as they headed down Hyde Road towards Gorton. Irene Rose, with Grace's assistance, had prepared a hamper of food with the intention of at least one stop at some suitable rustic spot on the way to her destination, and another on the return journey. James Black clicked his tongue and shouted, "Get up, Susie, you slow today," on a regular basis, but kept his long thin leather whip stowed upright beside him in its holster. The only time he'd ever brought it into action was to drive away a rabid dog. He wouldn't dream of using it on his beloved Susie, not even to whisk it harmlessly above her head. The road was busy with traffic. Heavily laden goods wagons drawn by 2 or 4 used Shire horses carried bales of raw materials to outlying mills and factories, and ferried finished goods to the canal basins and railway warehouses for distribution throughout Britain and overseas. They competed for road space with horse-drawn omnibuses and a wide range of other vehicles, some horse-drawn and yet more pushed or pulled by labouring men and sometimes women. Genteel ladies, travelling like Irene Rose and Daniel by pony and trap, jostled with farmers in carts pulled by piebald ponies taking chickens, bacon, hams, vegetables and cheeses to market. Milk carts travelled out from dairies within the towns to distribute their precious liquid cargoes. Coal merchants delivered sacks containing jet-black nuggets of anthracite to the neat houses of the lower and higher middle classes, and sacks of nutty slack and brown coal to depots for collection by members of the labouring classes. Brewers' drays loaded with barrels of beer and ale sought space in their turn, often blocking the road outside public houses and inns. The omnibuses travelled at regular intervals up and down the road, ferrying merchants, salesmen, assorted moneymen, grand ladies, their daughters and their maids on shopping expeditions. In brief, all those who had the time and could afford to travel on them in and out of Manchester town centre. Ragged entrepreneurs darted between horses' hooves, armed with brushes and shovels to recover valuable horse shit for sale to market gardeners, commercial and domestic rose and other flower growers. Thus the road was a hive of activity, with much to attract young Daniel's attention, both in the built-up areas they passed through, with their shops, their throngs of pedestrians, their shoppers, window and actual, offices, civic and commercial buildings, and the open spaces of countryside that still separated them. They plodded on their steady way through West Gorton, now rapidly developing as an industrial suburb, manufacturing steam locomotives for the fast-developing railway network and static steam engines to power the factories and mills. They passed under the arches carrying the railway line from London Road Station, and were soon into open countryside with a scattering of cottages and the occasional small farm, before skirting the new pleasure and zoological gardens at Bellevue, opened by a Mr. Jennison from Adswood a couple of years before, and entering the town of Gorton. Like its westerly neighbour, this town had embraced engineering, in the form of textile machinery manufactories. Their journey up to this point had been over fairly flat land, rising very slightly, Manchester town being at the centre of a great, shallow, saucer-shaped depression within the landscape. Now their route began to climb a little more, as they passed Brookfield Unitarian Church with its soaring steeple to their right, and eventually Tanyard Brow, a lane lined with 17th century cottages, descending steeply to their left into the steep-sided valley of Gore Brook, the tannery from which it derived its name stinking to high heaven, much to young Daniel's disgust and discomfort. The road levelled out as they wound their way up and over the reddish canal bridge, to find themselves once more in open countryside. James noticed a rather large and palatial building rapidly nearing the end of construction in open parkland to his left at Debdale. Some manufacturer treating himself to a more accommodating residence, no doubt, James thought. No matter how deep the recession and the degree to which workers were thrown out of work, or, if they were lucky, kept at their mundane and repetitive tasks, suffering yet more reductions to their starvation wages, the mill owners' lives and lifestyles seemed unaffected. Still, these hard-working souls were used to luxury. They had no intention of sharing, let alone alleviating their workers' distress, and who could blame them? To their right, flat agricultural grazing land, with occasional cottages and farmhouses, found itself interspersed with the open scars of large and increasingly deep clay pits, amongst which the smoky kilns of brickworks could be seen. This was red clay country, where hundreds of labouring men toiled with long thin-bladed spades, carving out of the sticky, impervious ground the raw material for Manchester's expanding slums and manufactories. Here they cut, pressed, moulded and fired nature's bounty into millions of bright red building blocks. Once laid and mortared, row upon row, they'd be transformed into the walls of towering buildings, tall, slender chimney stacks, graceful, towering railway viaducts, and cramped dwellings, following which the bright red would turn a uniform, sooty black within weeks. In the distance, beyond Reddish Vale and the small village of Reddish, cotton mill chimneys belched their dark acidic fumes into the sky from the Cheshire town of Stockport, rising up and above both banks of the River Mersey. To their left, the view over the flat green landscape, with its small, hawthorn-edged and tree-lined fields, was similarly punctuated by groupings of towering black chimneys. These denoted the locations of the distant mill towns of Droylsden, Oldham, and Ashton-under-Lyne. Behind them, just discernible through the yellowy-brown smoke haze, rose the Pennine chain of hills, separating the cotton towns of Lancashire from the wool towns of the West Riding of Yorkshire. Irene Rose pointed the hills out to Daniel. "When you can't see the hills, it means it's raining," she informed him, "and when you can see them, it's about to." Young Daniel frowned at this observation, whilst James laughed. She gazed around and wondered how long it would take before these patches and broken belts of greenery and open space finally succumbed to the onslaught of the land-hungry Malc modern industry and the factory system. She hugged young Daniel, whose attention was drawn skywards. Something had caught his attention. Look at the bird, Auntie Rose." She followed his pointing finger, and her eyes made contact. A bird of prey hovered no more than 20 feet above the grass verge on the opposite side of the road. Then, in a flash, its wings swept back, it dropped like a stone, before flying upwards once more, a vole in its talons. "It's a kestrel, Daniel. It's caught its breakfast." "I'm hungry, Auntie Rose." The words were no sooner spoken than James Black reacted like the good servant he was. "There's a reet greyly spot up ahead if you're wanting a break, Miss Rose." Irene Rose laughed. "No, not just yet, James. We'll have a stop for a picnic once we're through Denton. Daniel can have some bread and cheese whilst we're on the move." She gave Daniel a squeeze and bent down to open the hamper. James responded with a "Righto, Miss Rose, you knows best," as though she didn't, judging by his tone of voice. James was hungry, but then he always was. Unlike his wife, Michael was busy, organising teams of workmen to visit factories and mills, to organise workers, to hold meetings and to elect delegates, to attend the Trades Delegate Conference. The economic situation had continued to deteriorate through June and July. Indeed, on July the 9th, the editorial of the Manchester Times observed, "Any man passing through the district and observing the conditions of the people will at once perceive the deep and ravaging distress that prevails, laying industry prostrate, desolating families, and spreading abroad discontent and misery where recently happiness and content were enjoyed. The picture which the manufacturing districts present is absolutely frightful. Hungry and half-clothed men and women are stalking through the streets begging for bread." The same month, Manchester townspeople had raised £2,800 by subscription to purchase a gift to mark the birth of the Prince of Wales. After a public outcry, this was diverted to purchase bedding and flannel to be distributed to 6,500 needy people. The first major coordinated attack on workers' wage levels had taken place a few weeks before in Staffordshire, where colliers were now engaged in a grim struggle against wage cuts. However, these were turnouts with a difference. In response to the mine owners' imposition of reduced wages, the Staffordshire colliers not only stopped work and walked out of their pits, but countered the employers' action with demands of their own, vowing not to return to work unless they received wage increases and a shorter working week. This attempt to turn a defensive action into an offensive one was virtually unprecedented. Matthew Etherow had informed Michael he was sure he detected the hand of the manufacturers behind the decision of the pit owners to impose wage reductions in Staffordshire. He knew mill and other factory owners in Manchester were demanding reduced prices for their fuel, and felt the mine owners in Staffordshire would be subject to the same pressures. In other words, he felt the mine owners were not simply reacting to a lack of demand as a result of the general economic downturn, which Matthew believed had now peaked. If he was correct, and the reports from the Clayton pit the previous autumn tended to indicate he was, it certainly fitted a pattern. Coal was a significant part of overheads for any pottery manufacturer, as it was the only fuel available for the kilns, without which the pots couldn't be fired, and they were the Staffordshire coal owners' main customers. Not only would reduced coal prices cut manufacturers' overheads dramatically, they'd adversely affect the manufacturer's old enemy and upholders of the Corn Laws, the landowners who owned the coal deposits. The manufacturers no doubt hoped they could pressure the coal owners into breaking ranks with the other landowners with agricultural interests, thereby winning them to support repeal and the cause of free trade. Like their Manchester brethren, many of the Staffordshire colliers were active Chartists, and the vast majority certainly supported the People's Charter, as did their trade union delegates. As a result, the miners linked demands for the Charter to be made the law of the land with their claim for higher wages and a shorter working week. Thus, the strikes had a political dimension, but not in the way the Anti-Corn Law League and their middle-class sponsors had envisaged. The colliers made it clear they wished to have no truck with the League. By mid-July, mill workers in the towns to the east of Manchester became embroiled. The 25% wage cuts predicted by Matthew the previous August were now being imposed. The mill owners in the towns of Hyde, Denton, Stalybridge, Duckenfield and Ashton-under-Lyne took the lead and coordinated their actions. All were close neighbours, and most were members of or supported the Anti-Corn Law League. The trade unionists and Chartists who'd attended Irene Rose's dinner party were at the centre of the workers' response and, like Michael O'Donnell, were already busy organising mass meetings and encouraging workers to elect and mandate their representatives to attend the Trades Delegate Conference. The date and venue for this had now been determined. They decided it would take place in a week's time on the 15th and 16th of August at the Sherwood Inn in Manchester, immediately before the National Chartist Convention to be held on the 17th and 18th. Its purpose was to provide and organise coordinated leadership and support for those workers already under attack, to promote solidarity action and convince the Chartist Convention to provide clear national political leadership. The Pony and Trap had now entered the small market town of Denton, which boasted a few textile mills and a small number of specialist engineering works, but whose main source of employment was the manufacture of felt hats. As they reached the junction with the Stockport to Ashton Road at Crown Point, Irene Rose couldn't help noticing the area around the crossroads, with its collection of small shops, a hotel, and the nearby market square, was unusually quiet. She also noticed that bluebottles, members of the newly formed police force, seemed to be buzzing about the corner of every street, as though expecting trouble. Maybe the town was expecting a visit from some notable, or even royalty. Whoever it was, she decided, couldn't be particularly popular, judging by the lack of interest displayed by the people. James clicked his tongue and Susie set off once more. Soon they'd reached the outskirts of the town, passing the ancient white-walled Angel public house. The road now descended sharply into the valley of the River Tame, on the other side of which lay the cotton town of Hyde. Here, she decided, was the ideal spot for their picnic. Her mother's old friend lived in the small hamlet of Godley, about 3 miles further on, situated on the eastern side of Hyde, and separated from Broadbottom by one of the foothills of the Pennines, perched on top of which was the village of Mottram in Longdendale. She instructed James to pull on to the grass verge. They picnicked by the river, beneath some elms. "Look, Daniel." "What is it, Auntie Rose?" She bent to show him a palm wide open. "It's a newt, Daniel." "It's very pretty." "Yes, it is, Daniel. It's beautiful. A shiny living jewel." She put her open hand into the water of the small pond, and Daniel watched as the newt wriggled its tail and powered off into the shelter of some waterweed. "Auntie Rose, will you tell me about my mummy?" It came out of the blue, a question Irene Rose simply hadn't expected. Daniel had never mentioned his mother before. Caught off balance, she tried to work out how to handle the situation. She turned to him and ruffled his thick black hair. "Of course I will. What would you like to know?" "Not now. Tell me later when we go home." Irene Rose frowned and looked into the youngster's dark brown eyes. "Why not now, Daniel?" "Because when I ask Daddy it makes him sad, and that makes me sad. I don't want to be sad until I get home. If I go to bed feeling sad, I know I'll wake up in the morning and be happy again." "All right, Daniel, on one condition." He gazed into her eyes, a question on his face. She put her arms around him to give him a reassuring hug. "We will talk about your mother later, but don't be sad when we do. There's no reason to be. Bess would hate the idea. She wants you to be happy. She loves you and always will." He nodded and stood up. "Let's go back to James," he said. "I think he's lonely." Irene Rose watched as the youngster made his way back to the pony and trap. Something about her conversation with Daniel niggled. She couldn't quite put her finger on the reason why, and that she found annoying. "Here thou art, Miss Rose." James lifted the wicker picnic hamper up off the ground and placed it on the floor of the trap next to Irene Rose's feet. He climbed up and took his place in front. "Art thou reet, young Daniel?" "I am reet, Mr. Black." "Get up, Susie, get on with yous." The pony pulled at its harness and they moved off the verge and made their way onto the road. Once over the river bridge, the road ascended steeply up to the crossroad in Hyde town centre. There they would turn left onto a fairly level road clinging to the valley side above a small river, a tributary of the Tame they were now leaving behind. Over the bridge, Irene Rose had a view of a new factory in the course of construction, a sign informing any passerby it was the property of Daniel Adamson and Son, iron founders. Susie strained, pulling the trap up the steep incline, James Black clicking his tongue and speaking gently to his charge, coaxing her onwards and upwards. Irene Rose suddenly laughed and embraced young Daniel. She placed her arm around his shoulder, hugging him tightly. He looked up at her, his dark brown eyes wide open in surprise. "You are a very clever lad," she said. Daniel nestled his head against her, but didn't ask what she meant, and she didn't feel the need to tell him. However, she now knew the answer to the question that had niggled at the back of her mind. In effect, Daniel was bilingual. When he talked to his father or to James, to Mary Upton or to friends of his own age and class, he spoke broad Lancashire, but when he spoke to her or to her father, he immediately switched to their mode of speech, and Irene Rose realised he did it automatically, seemingly without being conscious of it. He moved between two worlds and consequently had learnt to communicate in the language of both. It wasn't strained in any way, it just happened. She wondered how quickly he'd pick up the Irish language if Michael spoke to him in his own tongue. She realised there was a difference between understanding two dialects, two forms of what was in effect a common language, albeit derived from different linguistic roots due to previous migrations of peoples with similar but distinct tongues, and learning a new language altogether. Nonetheless, she wondered how quickly he would acquire the ability. This realization sparked other thoughts in her fertile imagination. She'd been reading one of Robert Owen's early publications, Observations on the Effects of the Manufacturing System, the night before. In it, Owen argued the materialist philosophy that nurture was as important as nature, if not more so, in moulding the development of a human being. Owen had come to realize the overall environment and the circumstances in which a human being grew up, the external influences upon that individual, their education and access to knowledge, the dominant moral values of those around them, determined in large part their own development and character, the degree to which they were able to flourish, and how they in turn influenced the development of others and the broader society to which they belonged. A philosophy he'd put into practice at the New Lanark Mills with amazingly positive results. Young Daniel lived and was growing up in two quite different environments, the one Irene Rose's father and she occupied, that of the privileged upper middle class, and the quite separate and contrasting one his father and his friends existed within, that of the working class. One a world of prosperity, and the other a world of deprivation and poverty. She wondered how this particular situation would affect the lad's personal development, and whether it might be harmful or otherwise. Was she doing him a service or a disservice? She wondered what Bess would have thought. These questions were still in her mind as they breasted the crest of the hill and turned left in Hyde Town Centre to cover the remaining couple of miles to Godley. The road clung to the steep, heavily wooded valley side, following the contours and remaining reasonably level. At last they were in sight of the towering stone-built mill in which her mother's friend once worked, and in the shadow of which her small cottage stood. The cottage, with its gritstone walls, which would have been a rich golden colour when it was first built, now looked strangely out of place with its small front garden, a colourful riot of pink, red and white roses, interspersed with dog daisies, lupins, hollyhocks and blue flowers Irene Rose couldn't identify. Before the mill had been built, this would have been fairly isolated open countryside, the Pennine foothills rising on two sides of it. James pulled up outside the gate, dismounted from his driving seat and went to assist his mistress and her young charge. At that point, the cottage front door opened, and a delighted and all too obviously healthy Alice greeted them cheerily. Chapter 6. Irene Rose and Daniel had risen early on the Sunday morning, following a convivial evening with Alice, who, far from being in trouble, had proved to be exactly the opposite. She assured the mill owner's daughter she had more than sufficient funds to live on, and she enjoyed extremely good health, and whoever was spreading tales about her should be ashamed of themselves. With that understood, Irene Rose had seized the opportunity to take young Daniel up onto nearby Werneth Low, a favourite beauty spot of hers. As they returned to say farewell to her late mother's friend, having almost drawn level with the mill gates, a horde of hundreds of obviously excited mill operatives began to leave a meeting on Godley Green opposite. Soon the pony and trap were at the centre of a vociferous, jostling crowd, intent on heading up the road towards Mottram. Susie, obviously nervous at this sudden activity all around her, whinnied shrilly and seemed about to shy. James, conscious of the animal's distress and worried she might bolt, reined her to a halt with a view to waiting whilst the multitude dispersed. Despite this, the pony reared, pawing the air with her front legs in panic. No sooner had she done so than a young fustian-clothed lad, who Irene Rose took to be a mill worker, caught Susie's bridle, expertly pulled her head down, and talking to the animal quietly, while stroking its velvet muzzle, managed to calm her. It crossed the mill owner's daughter's mind this couldn't have been the first time the lad had performed the trick. The youngster turned to James, still petting and calming the pony as he did so. "They picked bad time to be here, Meister." Irene Rose asked why the workers were marching up the road. "We're on the way to Mottram Moor for the mass meeting, missus. Happen workers have a long holiday afore 'em." "Wage cuts?" Irene Rose asked. "Aye, a full quarter off lads' and lasses' pay. They're no putting up with it, though. They reckons they might as well clem in idleness as clem in work." "Can I give you a lift to the meeting?" I owe you for calming the pony. It was very thoughtful of you. Nay, thank you kindly, missus. It won't seem right, me being seen with likes of they. Folks might think I'm a sellout. Anyways, I can gallop and catch 'em up." Irene Rose laughed. "I'm a Chartist and my husband's a trade union organiser. Come on, we won't bite, will we, Daniel?" The youngster grinned and made way for the young lad, who climbed on board, thanking Irene Rose as he did so. "Get up, Susie, you're going amongst friends," James Black said, urging the pony into action to catch up with the fast disappearing mill workers. "How old are you?" Irene Rose asked the youngster. "I'm turned 9-year-old," he replied, rather proudly. 9? And already working in a mill? "Nay, missus, I don't work in mill. Me feyther's a wheelwright and blacksmith, an independent man. He's dead agin me working as a wage slave, but he's a Chartist. I'm running messages for the mill workers from the strike leaders." By the time they caught up with the turnouts, Irene Rose had discovered the workers in 3 mills in nearby Staley Bridge had been informed the previous week that wages were being cut by 25%. The workers had immediately struck work. 2 of the mill owners had eventually backed down, but the third, William Bailey and Brothers, when approached by their hands, refused to change their policy and told their operatives if they didn't like it, they should go and play. At that point, the mill workers left the premises and marched around the town, informing the hands at other mills of their predicament and requesting assistance. By the end of the day, there wasn't a mill in Staley Bridge working. Now they were holding a meeting on the moor to plan their next moves. The lad, Jimmy Muirhouse, informed them a proposal would be put to the meeting that they should march through the neighbouring towns of Ashton-under-Lyne, Duckenfield and Hyde the next day, to build support and then to march to Manchester the following day. At the mention of the name Muirhouse, Irene Rose asked the lad if he knew a William Muirhouse. "William Muirhouse the bellman?" The lad seemed rather surprised. "You know him, missus? William's me uncle, me dad's brother." Irene Rose laughed. It was a small world. William Muirhouse from Hyde and a well-known Chartist orator had been a guest at her recent dinner party. The much-discussed Holy Month had evidently commenced. Unfortunately for the Anti-Corn Law League, the workers' agenda included the question of a fair day's pay for a fair day's work, the implementation of the People's Charter and the 10-hour bill, but the repeal of the Corn Laws didn't rate a mention. Once again, workers were saying this was an issue of no concern to them, and the middle and upper classes should sort their differences out between themselves. "You look like the cat that got the cream, Rose." "Do I? I can't imagine why." Irene Rose put down her embroidery and smiled. "I had a lovely weekend with Daniel. He's such good company. I took him to see Alice. She was in robust health and good spirits. The tale of distress that reached father seems to have been overstated, according to Alice, and I'm sure she'd have confided in me if there was a genuine problem." "Well, that's one less thing for you to worry about." "Yes, it is, and I'm sure father will be pleased." She looked at her husband, who picked up the lists of union delegates he'd been studying before he commenced their conversation. "Before we visited Alice, we had a lovely picnic." "Did you, Rose?" Michael asked. "That's nice." "Yes, it was, dear. And today we visited Mottram Moor. The views are magnificent. Have you been?" She finally captured her husband's attention. "You've been on Mottram Moor?" "Yes. I gave a lift to a young lad I met outside Godley Mill. He needed to be there by 2. His uncle's William Muirhouse." "You attended the meeting, Rose. I might have known. You have a habit of popping up in the most unlikely places," he responded with a laugh. "You must tell me all about it. I need to know the decisions they've taken. It can affect plans we have in train. Do you know something, Michael O'Donnell? I think it's time we had a nice cup of Darjeeling." Her husband looked at her for a moment, and then stood up. He frowned and shook his head once more. "You can be extremely frustrating at times, Irene Rose Etherow," he stated before smiling, bending down and kissing her affectionately on the forehead. "Don't worry, I'll make the tea. I know my place in this most peculiar example of a capitalist household." "That's very good of you, Michael," Matthew Etherow interjected with a grin as he entered the room. "Darjeeling would be perfect, I think. Do you agree, Rose, or would you prefer the orange pekoe? Darjeeling will be fine. Alice sends you her regards, Father. She's in really good spirits. There's nothing to worry about. Chapter 7. Right, what next, Michael? The small organising committee for the Trades Delegate Conference occupied an upstairs room in the Griffin Tavern in Ancoats, reviewing progress on the election of delegates and general preparations. Michael O'Donnell chaired the meeting, which consisted of James Leach, Thomas Abbott representing the warpers, George Hadfield, the spinners and stretchers, Daniel Donovan, the powerloom overlookers, and Peter Fraser from the steam engine makers. All hailed from Manchester, save Thomas, who lived in nearby Mouse Platting. Michael had provided the committee with a report of the activities on Mottram Moor the previous day, based on the information he'd received from Irene Rose. There had actually been 2 mass meetings, the first at 10 o'clock in the morning, addressed by 4 speakers: William Muirhouse, the bellman, George Candler, a mill operative, Robert Wilde, occupation unknown, and William Stevenson, a shoemaker. All were from Hyde, apart from Stevenson, who was from Staley Bridge, and all were Chartists, apart from Robert Wilde. The meeting determined to fight for a return to the wage rates of 1839, in effect a wage increase, for the 10-hour day, and the Charter to be made the law of the land. It sent runners to the nearby towns of Ashton-under-Lyne, Staley Bridge, Dukenfield and Hyde for a later meeting that day to ensure wider representation. At the second meeting held at 2 o'clock, which Irene Rose attended, Thomas Storer, a weaver from Ashton-under-Lyne, Thomas Mahone, a shoemaker from Staley Bridge, John Leach, a tailor from Hyde and no relation to James Leach, and John Crossley from Staley Bridge augmented the previous speakers. These 2 were Chartists, and despite an attempt to separate the demands of the Charter from the question of wages and hours, the workers overwhelmingly reaffirmed the decisions of the first meeting. They also resolved to march to Hyde the next day to win the town for a mass turnout, and to Manchester the day after. Daniel Donovan reported mass meetings had taken place at All Green in Dukenfield on the 2nd or 3rd of August, he wasn't sure which, and at Hague on the 5th. Here, 2 meetings had taken place, one in the morning and one in the evening. A further meeting had been held at the same venue the next day, presumably as a result of the evening meeting. Michael informed the committee a total of 69 delegates had been elected so far, representing a wide range of trades including boot and shoemakers, calico printers, colliers, cordwainers, cotton spinners, cotton powerloom weavers, dressers and dyers, factory operatives, fustian cutters, fustian powerloom weavers, grinders and strippers, hammermen, handloom weavers, hatters, labourers, moulders and foundry workers, mule spinners, piecers, plumbers and glaziers, powerloom overlookers, rope and twine makers, silk weavers, steam engine makers, tailors, warpers, wheelwrights and blacksmiths, and last but not least, the wire drawers and card makers. The delegates came from a wide number of towns around Manchester, including Ashton-under-Lyne, Bury, Bolton, Clayton, Dukenfield, Droylsden, Eccles, Hyde, Glossop, Lee, Middleton, Mouse Platting, Patricroft, Salford, Rochdale, Stalybridge and Stockport. The committee pinpointed weaknesses in the Lancashire towns of Accrington, Colne, Nelson and Rawtenstall, and the Cheshire town of Macclesfield, and resolved to send delegates there the next day. Additionally, they resolved to make contact with trade unions and Chartists further afield, including Preston, Liverpool, Birmingham, Lancaster and Glasgow, the steelmakers in Sheffield, and the wool textile workers of the West Riding of Yorkshire. Peter Fraser, the representative of the steam engine makers, insisted once a mill or factory turned out, some of the workers should remain to control events and prevent the owners drafting in alternative labour. He outlined simple measures that could be taken to foil such attempts. He also emphasised the need to keep essential services going. For example, he argued pit pumps should be taken over by colliers to prevent the mine workings flooding, and they should ensure pit props were replaced to prevent seams collapsing. He also argued that essential supplies must be maintained, and on no account must agricultural workers or any workers connected with food provision be involved in strike action. His points were agreed by the committee without dissension. By the time Michael brought the meeting to a close, all present were far more confident with the progress of events than hitherto. However, there remained plenty of time for further unconsidered drama to unfold. They were in an unprecedented situation, as were all the workers involved. The dispute hadn't been one of their choosing, and certainly not of their timing. A downturn in trade was never a good time to strike, but they knew its outcome depended on the degree to which they could seize the initiative and remove control of events from the mill and factory owners' grasp. Irene Rose had just made a meal for young Daniel with Grace's assistance, and was about to sit down with the lad to eat when her father entered the house. "Rose, Rose, where are you? I've news." He put his head around the dining-room door. "There you are, love. I thought you'd be in the library." "No, father, I'm here, as you can see. But why are you so excited?" "Where's Michael?" "He has a meeting, father. He'll be home about 9 with a bit of luck." "Where will he be? I think it might be useful if I give him this information tonight." "I'm not sure, but I think they're holding all their committee meetings at the Griffin on Great Ancoat Street. But he may be out of town. Why don't you tell me what you know? You look fit to burst. Take your hat and coat off, and I'll pour you some tea." He smiled at her, doing as she said. He turned to Daniel. "Forgive me, young man. I didn't mean to be rude. I'm just overexcited. Rather silly at my age, don't you think? How are you, my boy?" "I'm fine, Uncle Matthew," the lad replied. "There you are, father. Mind you don't burn your lips." Matthew nodded, pouring the milk. "What time's Daniel picking up his son?" "Young Daniel's staying here tonight. He's keeping me company, aren't you, Daniel?" "Yes, Auntie Rose," the lad agreed with a grin. "I thought you were meeting Councillor Davitt today, father," Irene Rose said, changing the subject, as he stirred a teaspoon of sugar into his tea. "That's where I've come from. That's how I know my theory is correct. 5,000 workers paraded through Hyde today. Every single mill and every factory in the town's closed. Tomorrow they're marching on Manchester," he said, sounding more than a little excited. "It's a rolling strike. Stalybridge, Dugganfield and Ashton are already solid behind the turnout. Davitt says they're expecting at least 7,000 workers to march on Manchester." "Davitt can't be pleased. Isn't he a mill owner?" "No, he owns an engineering workshop, but that's not the point. The manufacturers are pleased. They say the operatives are playing into their hands." "Father, the manufacturers are not going to provoke trouble, are they?" she responded, sounding concerned. "Michael tells me the one thing they are insisting on is that the workers should refrain from any kind of violence. They're quite aware the Tory government will use any excuse to send troops in." "No, the corporation's instructed Daniel Maud to meet the strikers on the outskirts, accompanied by a large force of police and cavalry as a show of strength, but to allow them access into the town." "Daniel Maud? He's a Justice of the Peace, isn't he?" Irene Rose asked. "A Liberal, appointed by the last Whig government, as I remember." "Exactly, Rose. Like the manufacturers and the vast majority of the corporation, they're all Liberals and Radicals to a man. Except for Burley, father. He's your fly in the ointment. A mill owner, but a Tory through and through. He had a letter in yesterday's Guardian saying the strikers should be put down before they start rioting and calling on Peel to send troops to Manchester. He's out on a limb, Rose, and between you and me there's more than one manufacturer would like to see his premises under attack." Matthew took a sip from his tea and glanced across at young Daniel. The lad continued to concentrate on his meal. "I think the manufacturers are in for a surprise, father, particularly those who want repeal of the Corn Laws." "They all want repeal, Rose." "Then they're all in for a surprise. Presumably they think the workers will expend their energies marching about and picketing, giving the masters and their press cohorts time to frighten the government, and then they'll all return to work, tails between their legs. That's the general idea. Well, I think they're making a big mistake from what I've been told this afternoon. This strike's going to be well organised. It's going to spread far wider than Manchester, even South East Lancashire and North East Cheshire. The Manchester manufacturers will find themselves asking their workers permission to carry out all kinds of essential tasks pretty soon." Judging by his surprised expression, this was news even the Millowner hadn't anticipated. "How do you mean, Rose?" "Strike committees are issuing licenses to allow essential work to take place. One company in Ashton has requested permission to remove cloth from a vat of dye to prevent it spoiling. They've been given permission, but on the workers' terms. Well, good for them. Mill owners have ruled over their workers with ticket law for far too long. It's time the boot was on the other foot. Have you thought of your own position, Father?" "Of course I have." "Aren't you going to tell me?" "I'm going to pay my operatives as though they're in work. I'm going to give them permission to turn out." "You're no different than the rest of your class, really, are you, Father? Except by degree, of course." "What on earth do you mean? I support my employees. I want them to succeed. I can't see anybody else doing that." Matthew was surprised and stung by his daughter's remark. "Neither can I, with the exception of John Fielden at Todmorden," Irene Rose said. "I think he may, but that isn't the point. You should take the workers into your confidence, Father, and ask them what they want to do. They may want to carry on working. They may want to make an agreement with you to match any money they donate to the strike fund, shilling for shilling." She waited for him to respond, but as he didn't, she continued to underline her point. "It wouldn't cost you any more than if you were paying them for not working. In fact, it would cost you far less, and assist the unions at the same time. After all, the workers produce far more than you pay them in wages, don't they? You could forgo part of your profits. On the other hand, they may wish to accept your offer in order to demonstrate their solidarity, but you should at least consult them. That's my view anyway." Matthew gazed into his daughter's eyes. Once again Irene Rose had taken him by surprise, and once again she was making sense. "The point is, Father, nobody's infallible, and the more people take part in discussing the issues at stake and making a decision accordingly, the more likely it will turn out to be a good one. And if it's wrong, a lot more people learn the lesson. Making mistakes is a democratic right, isn't it? If it isn't, it should be. Isn't it one of the means by which we learn at the end of the day? There may be issues you haven't even thought of, no matter how well-meaning you are, or how much consideration you give to a problem. Isn't that one of the lessons Robert Owen learned at New Lanark? It's not sufficient to make decisions for other people, no matter how well-intentioned. You have to involve people in making the decisions that affect them." "You know, I think you're right, Rose. I was talking about the cooperative with Mary Upton the other day, and congratulated her on its success and the way it's developing. We were talking about obtaining cloth and setting up another workers' cooperative to make clothing for the mill workers instead of the shoddy stuff they have to buy now at extortionate prices. Mary made much the same point as you, explaining the enterprise's success arises in no small part because of the members' involvement in all aspects of decision-making, including the election of their manager. They know the cooperative's theirs. They realise only they can make it successful, and it's in their interest to do so. I hate to say it, Father, but when I borrowed the £50 off you so they could start the enterprise, I did tell you what would happen." Matthew smiled wryly. "Yes, I must admit you did. But what really impressed me was something else Mary told me. Evidently they made a healthy return again this year, but rather than take a full dividend, they agreed to reinvest 65% of their surplus back into the business at their last finance meeting, instead of the normal 35%. Not many mill owners would do that. They reinvest as little as possible and maximise their short-term gains." Irene Rose smiled again, but thought it wise not to say, "I told you so," once more. "What it proves is that Owen was right," Matthew continued. "Cooperative enterprises are a viable alternative to laissez-faire. Workers are quite capable of running their own businesses, pay themselves a decent wage, and still have leisure time." Irene Rose nodded her agreement. "There's something else I should have mentioned, Father. After the meeting on Mottram Moor, I spoke to two of the strike leaders, William Muirhouse and Thomas Storer. Muirhouse chaired the meeting, and in his opening address made a very important point which sums the struggle up for me. He told the gathering, 'I must inform you, we are not here for a wage question or for a religious question. It is a national question. Social peace and happiness is our desire. The People's Charter is our means. Once they'd elected their leaders, I told them how Bess Ackroyd had persuaded Lisa Hodgkinson and her husband to make sure the mill engine was put out of action at the Nelson Mill. Yes, I remember. It was astute thinking on Bess's part. It said tragedy we lost her. She's sorely missed. Nathaniel West should have been brought to justice. It said damn disgrace. Nobody should get away with murder. Well, I think if you check, Bess's lesson has been learnt and learnt well. Wherever a turnout's taken place, the workers have removed the main drain plugs from the boilers. Most have been removed and hidden. Those of the most backward employers have been driven into the boiler with sledgehammers. Something made Matthew look across the table at young Daniel. The lad was staring intently at Irene Rose, and he didn't look happy.